2021 season looks bright for Oklahoma and the 2022 recruiting class as well. We got Jason Ray on the line from Last Word on College Football to break down the Sooners as he typically does. Jason, how you doing today?
Doing good, Mark. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. Good to see you as always. So there's a number of interesting targets that Oklahoma and Lincoln Riley and his staff are focused on. Gentry Williams may be the headliner, but 4 really good gets that Oklahoma would like to reel in.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think, and that's important from a leadoff perspective. Gentry Williams, #1 athlete in the country, number 13 overall recruit in the country based on 247 composite rankings. He's a local guy in Tulsa, Booker T. Washington product. So he's been a pretty big Oklahoma lean for a while. Certainly hasn't pulled the trigger as of yet, but he would be a great get. I think, if nothing else from the persona, I think there's a lot of people out there that have, had a little bit of, it's obviously nitpicking from a recruiting perspective because Oklahoma has done pretty well over the last few years. But I think a lot of pundits, at least locally, have got on Riley just a little bit, just in terms of his inability to secure some of the big names in state. So if they're able to get Gentry Williams, I think that's a big get, not only for the state just because of how good of a player he is, #1 player in the state of Oklahoma, obviously, but just the ability for him to, Oklahoma to get some more of those in-state recruiting, in-state guys and not have them go out. There's been a few that's gone to Ohio State and, a couple of went to Alabama. So I think having that in his back pocket is really good. So, in terms of a couple of other ones, Gabriel Brownlow Dindy out of Lakewood, Florida is another big one. He's a defensive tackle. Again, he's very, very heavily on the lean to Oklahoma. 5-star defensive tackle, #3 defensive tackle in the country. So that's a big one as well. From a running back perspective, Gavin Sawchuk is another one to keep an eye on. #2 running back in the country, number 23 overall recruit, another 5-star, very heavily on Oklahoma's side as well. And then, the last one that might be beneficial for people to see from a defensive end perspective, especially thinking about Oklahoma possibly after this 2021 season, losing a bit of that nucleus on the defensive end side. So Omari Abor, who is from he's from Duncanville, Texas. He's another 4-star guy, #2 strong side defensive end in the country, number 44 overall recruit in the country. Again, another heavy lean to Oklahoma as well. I know we talked a little bit on before, and just in terms of how things are so fluid with this recruits, especially from 2022. These kids can change their mind so many times between now and then. But I think it's good overall to see where Oklahoma is from a target going into that 2022 recruiting period.
Jason Ray on the line from Last Word on College Football. Check out his work and the rest of the crew over there. Of course, so we talk college football here every day. Our aim, our mission, our goal is best discussion, debate, and analysis. So block it on in. Once you subscribe, hit the bell for the notifications. That way you know when we're going live. Raleek Brown gained a ton of attention when he made his announcement a couple of weeks ago. Top-rated player out of the state of California, #3 in the state, #3 at the position of running back. So that obviously was a huge get for Lincoln Riley to go out of state and reel in somebody from the West Coast.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think Oklahoma is gone head to head with Texas A&M on the few recruits here as of late. Some have been successful. I think Wanye Morris was a transfer portal guy that was really between Oklahoma and Texas A&M, and then Eric Gray. There was some thoughts that maybe he would consider Texas or Texas A&M, and Oklahoma eventually got him. And here's another one at the running back position, as you mentioned, one of the best running backs in the country, #3 overall, I believe, number 3 running back, number 25 overall recruit in the country from 247. I think Oklahoma fans probably take this with a little bit of a grain of salt, given the track record that they've had over the last 2 years on securing commitments from top-rated running backs early on, only to lose them later on in the cycle. So I think, to your point, Riley going in there and getting that kid out of a really well-established high school at Mater Dei is really a big coup for Riley. But I think Oklahoma fans will probably have more of a kind of a wait-and-see mentality with him. But having a 5-star commitment early on in the period is really important. I'm not sure what you believe from some of these kids from a social media perspective, but he has come out and say that he has no interest in a long recruiting process. He has no interest in wavering. He wants to be done with it. He wanted to get this, completed and not have to worry about, the recruiting process in the middle of the football season next year. So, I don't know if how well you take that, but all signs point to, maybe this being more of a secure commitment than what Oklahoma has seen in the past. And, looking at some of the 2020 guys that Oklahoma has right now, they have 5 commitments, number 5 overall ranking in 247. Rayleigh Brown is the headliner at this point from a running back perspective, but Oklahoma already has 3 other commitments from the wide receiver position. 3 of the top 17 wide receivers in the country are committed to Oklahoma at this point. Probably we talked a little bit about Gentry Williams being the number 1 overall player in the state of Oklahoma. Talon Shetron from Edmond Santa Fe, wide receiver, is probably the number 2 player in the state of Oklahoma overall. Wide receiver, number 7 wide receiver in the country, number 57 overall player at another local product here in Oklahoma, actually in Edmond, out of Edmond Santa Fe High School. And then the next wide receiver, Luther Burden from St. Louis, Missouri, number 69 overall player, number 10 ranked wide receiver in the country as well, has committed to Oklahoma. And he is very active on Twitter and social media, very big proponent of Oklahoma. Almost everything that you see is very pro Oklahoma, trying to get other kids to come join for that 2020 class. And then last, Jordan Hudson, who is a more recent commitment out of Garland, Texas, number 16 wide receiver in the country, number 127 overall commitment. So 4 of the 5 guys that Oklahoma has committed in this class are on the offensive side of the ball. The other one is a linebacker, Colby McKenzie, inside linebacker, number 95 overall, number 5 inside linebacker in the country. So the one thing that you've seen consistently, Mark, with early on in this class and then the 2021 class, is the quality of commitment that Oklahoma has got is a lot better than we've seen over the last few years. I know Oklahoma only signed 16, 17 kids in the 2021 cycle. It ended up working well with all the transfers that they've got through the portal, and I think that was deliberate. But I think the one thing that people will notice from Oklahoma's recruiting over these last few years is, specifically the last couple of years, is the quality of recruits. Typically, they're mostly 4- and 5-star guys. There's a couple 3-star guys littered in there as well, but the quality is, I think, what Oklahoma fans and people will probably notice out of these kids over the last couple of recruiting periods.
Jason Ray on the line talking Oklahoma football with us, as he does on a regular basis. We encourage you to head on over to Last Word on College Football to check out Jason's work and the rest of the crew there. Last Word on College Football. And of course, subscribe here, hit the bell for the notifications. That way you know when we're going live, which is just about every day and usually multiple times per day, talking college football all the time. No off season, all the time. All right, 2021 Oklahoma schedule. I'm intrigued by this week 1 matchup, not so much the matchup, but just that Oklahoma is going to go down to play at Tulane. You don't see that very often, where the status of an Oklahoma will go on the road to take on a group of 5 team.
Yeah, it's very interesting to start the year. I mean, I think it's been 20, 30 years since Oklahoma has opened in a true road game. A few years ago they played Houston in Reliance Stadium, I believe it was. It's more of a neutral game, but this will be a true road game. I think probably there's a little bit of recruiting area there that they want to get some footprint in the New Orleans area. I think this was a 2-for-1 deal where Tulane will come to Norman twice, and Oklahoma will go to New Orleans once. I believe that's the way the contract reads. Oklahoma played Tulane a few years ago in Norman, I think about 3 or 4 years ago. But to your point, Mark, Tulane is certainly a mid-major, and you don't see an Oklahoma travel to them very often. But it's a decent mid-major team for Oklahoma to have on the schedule. 3 straight winning seasons, 3 straight bowl seasons for Tulane. And I think one of the things from a scheduling perspective that's very interesting is, Tulane deploys that spread option offense that you don't see a whole lot in the country. Obviously when you play a team like Army, Navy, and their typical triple option offense. That's a lot to take in. But then the spread option brings a little bit of different intricacies to it. So I think from a scheduling perspective, I think it's good that Oklahoma opens with Tulane versus someone else, and maybe Tulane being their second game or third game of the year, where they have to take a week or so to prepare. So I think Grinch will probably use this as an opportunity throughout the spring and then fall practices to really fine tune assignments and make sure that Oklahoma's in a good position to really defend that attack that you don't see a whole lot.
Nebraska comes to town week 3, September 18th, and of course the headliner in regards to non-conference games. Hopefully Nebraska's up to the challenge. It wouldn't appear based on 4-8, 5-7, and I believe a 2-5 finish this past year in a limited schedule that Nebraska's up to it. But they're recruiting in the top 20. Maybe they'll pull it together under Scott Frost and make it a game. But of course, that reeks of Big 12 history and the titanic matchups of the 60s, 70s, and 80s into the 90s between those two.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of people were very excited when Oklahoma got Nebraska back on the schedule. Really, Oklahoma has the rivalry with Texas, obviously, and then Oklahoma State to a lesser degree, but certainly that in-state rivalry. But I think most historians from an Oklahoma perspective would say that the Nebraska rivalry was the best rivalry. It was more competitive rivalry. It was it was very a respectful rivalry between the two clubs. There was very little kind of trash talk or things like that. So it was it was one of those rivalries that I think a lot of people missed having that off the schedule. So Oklahoma will host Nebraska, then they'll go to Lincoln next year. And I think we had talked about this earlier, a few times ago, just about knowing that Nebraska will be on the schedule. And a big year for Scott Frost, as we mentioned, probably, I think it's 3 straight losing seasons, been there for 4 years, right? So yes, absolutely. Scott Frost looks like he's recruiting at a high level, at least getting back to the level that Nebraska people would become accustomed to. So yeah, it's a pivotal year for them to get going and put some of that recruiting success that they've had on the field.
The Big 12 plays the truest schedule of any in the country, meaning that for me, it's the truest, most credible championship because everybody plays everyone. There's no discussion over, they dodged these 3 teams and they had to play this gauntlet because they had to play everybody difficult in the other division. Nothing like that. Everybody plays everyone. I love the way the Big 12 setup is because of that. Doesn't cause for much debate because of what I just mentioned, but I'm looking for difficult stretches here, and I'm seeing Texas, TCU are back-to-back, and a lot of people are expecting TCU to bounce back and be a pretty good club this year. Then after the bye week in early November, stretch drive of at Baylor, Iowa State, and then at Oklahoma State to conclude. Those would be the 2 stretches that stand out to me at least.
Yeah, absolutely. And looking at this as it published yesterday, those were the 2 very key stretches that I would see from an Oklahoma perspective. TCU is improved. Not sure what they'll have from a quarterback perspective next year. What that looks like. But yeah, the first one that you'd mentioned, specifically, if you want to look at Kansas State and then Texas, obviously in the Cotton Bowl. At Kansas State, they beat Oklahoma the last 2 years. You have to think Oklahoma will have that one circled on their calendar very early. And I think it's maybe a little bit beneficial that Oklahoma has Kansas State and Texas back-to-back. So a lot of times you've seen over the years, Oklahoma will have a game before Texas, and they're really focused on Texas, and maybe they're a little bit kind of lackadaisical in their effort against that team. So I think it's good that they'll have a team right there waiting for them. Waiting for them that will certainly have their attention. And then, as you mentioned, to close the year at Baylor, the one thing that's good, Oklahoma does have a bye week between, as you mentioned, between Texas Tech before they travel to Waco to play Baylor. So I think that will be important. Oklahoma, didn't play well against Baylor early on or late in the year this past year, but certainly came up with a victory. And then Iowa State at home. I think the Big 12 schedule makers, it's going to be either feast or famine with that game, right? So a lot of thoughts early on was that game would be kind of front-loaded on the schedule because both of those teams will be probably top 10 preseason. a top 10 preseason team. So it's kind of a feast or famine. You wait till the end of the year. Not sure what, obviously not sure what will happen with either of those teams. Still could be a top 5, top 10 matchup, but, should either of those teams, kind of hit a bump in the road, the game might lose a little bit of its luster there at the end. And then certainly Oklahoma ends the season back in a familiar territory, playing Oklahoma State around the Thanksgiving holiday. So again, Oklahoma has had Oklahoma State's number over the past few years. Mike Gundy has not been successful at all against Oklahoma. Oklahoma seems to play a lot better in that game. Oklahoma State seems to be a little closer to the vest from a kind of from a strategy perspective. So it'll be interesting to see how that works out. I think the schedule sets up for Oklahoma well to make a run, just in terms of they have a little bit of a tough stretch there in the beginning of October. Then they have a stretch where they're hosting TCU, they play at Kansas, hosting Texas Tech, and then so they get a little bit of a break in terms of the schedule there, and then it certainly heats up at the end of the season when you would hope that you're playing your best ball, and then certainly you have hopefully the Big 12 championship game at that point for Oklahoma. So it does set up in such a way that they have an opportunity early on to get some of these new faces acclimated to the team, and you playing specifically when you talk about some of the transfers and offensively getting that going as well. So I think it like I said, it does set up to give Oklahoma an opportunity to run the table, which is something they haven't done in quite some time. They haven't finished the season undefeated. So I think that's one of those things that's going to be looked at depending on when they lose and who they lose to. But I think it's pretty important for Oklahoma. The amount of momentum that they have this year coming into this season is, can they go through a season where they're undefeated going into that college football playoff?
If you just look at the conference schedule, if I'm not mistaken, if you go back to 2016, that would have been the year they lost to Ohio State and Houston, but then they won all the games in the Big 12 and were undefeated in the conference.
Yeah, that's right. You're absolutely right. And I think where I was going with that, just an overall non-conference plus conference finishing undefeated. But the thing that Oklahoma has seen over the last few years is every year they lose to a team that they're really not supposed to lose to. They've lost more games than any team in the country when they've been a 20-plus favorite. So I think that's the lesson learned that you could probably see, hopefully, come across this year from a concentrating from an effort perspective each day in and day out. It's hard. Kids aren't going to get up for every single game every weekend, but being able to avoid that upset is something that's been a bugaboo from a program perspective specifically since Riley has taken over.
Well, when you mentioned the difficulty of showing up every week and having your A game every week, and then that probability for not just Oklahoma, any top team that somebody's going to jump up, somebody that's capable but under the radar, that would be, again, understandable, unless it was Kansas State again. As you mentioned off the top, that's the one that should be circled. They should be ready for that one.
Yeah, I would think so. I mean, I wouldn't imagine that they wouldn't be ready for that game. But I mean, I think looking at a team that possibly could jump up and bite Oklahoma under the radar. I mean, Baylor looks like that could be an opportunity traveling there before maybe their two biggest games. Certainly their biggest game at home against Iowa State. Looking at that, maybe a Texas or maybe a TCU is another one that you would think about that would be under the radar. But other than that, you got your big games: Texas, Iowa State, Oklahoma State. And I talked about this in one of my articles this week. Was really kind of previewing the schedule. Is Texas has a tougher schedule leading up to Oklahoma. They play Louisiana and Arkansas in the non-conference, but if they happen to come through that unscathed, we talked about whether or not me and you agree with this from a preseason perspective. Texas is very likely to be a top 10, top 15 team to start the season. So if they go through some of those teams unscathed and they're undefeated going into the Cotton Bowl, they are most certainly would be a top 10, if not a top 5 team by that time.
Good conversation as always with Jason Ray. Last word on college football. Jason, we appreciate you stopping by, and we'll talk some more recruiting, I'm sure, and get everyone set for spring practice. That's got to be coming up sometime in the next month, I would think.
Yeah, I think Oklahoma's starting in March. They pushed the spring game back just a little bit to late April, but I think they're getting started here in the March timeframe.
Sounds good. All right, Jason, appreciate it.
All right, thanks, Mark.